Hi again. For some reason, my other camera has stopped focusing when I use it to take video, so I'm going to have to look into that. So I'm doing this on my cell phone. And what I want to do today, relatively quickly, though actually this will probably go on for a bit, is to talk first about Gothic. Gothic as a cultural phenomenon, and Gothic also as a form of novel, and in fact a form of poetry as well. A shift takes place starting around the 1740s in England, as people who had been basically addicted to neoclassical architecture, that is to say architecture that looks like a Greek temple, or perhaps the Roman Pantheon, the kind of Texas state capitol, United States Capitol. That's neoclassical architecture, and many of the country houses in England had been built in that form, as well as the churches and so forth. And the Gothic style, and if you want to visualize Gothic, though I'll be giving you some visuals later, would be epitomized, I think, for most people in the world by Notre Dame in Paris, Westminster Abbey in London, and so forth. I think you can kind of visualize that, but again, as I said, I'll be showing you some pictures in a minute. This style begins to reassert itself in England right along with sensibility during the 1740s, because as people begin to hunger and thirst for more emotion, they see the Gothic as a architectural form that embodies the Gothic, or embodies emotion and provokes emotion and spirituality and fear and scary stuff a lot more effectively and interestingly than the neoclassical. And so people begin actually to convert neoclassical buildings into neo-Gothic buildings. They begin to build Gothic buildings or neo-Gothic buildings from scratch, but they also tend to valorize the Gothic buildings that they still have around, such as Westminster Abbey and many Gothic ruins, especially ruins of monasteries and abbeys that are scattered around the country. And it's from one of these, though not a ruin, that the novel Northanger Abbey takes its name. Many of these abbeys, once Henry VIII broke from the Catholic Church, were abandoned, but others were given to his nobles, his aristocrats, his minions, as their estates. And then they were redone, they were desanctified and redone as dwelling places. And that's what Northanger Abbey is, the place that you will visit eventually in this novel. It is an old abbey that has been converted in to the mansion of a country estate. In any case, so there is an architectural element to the rise of the Gothic or the Neo-Gothic during the middle of the 18th century, and then continuing on and becoming stronger and stronger up through the Victorian era. And at the same time, there is in literature I don't even want to call it the invention of, but the emergence of, I suppose, a form that is called the Gothic novel. Gothic novels, the first Gothic novel is called what people usually consider to be the first Gothic novel written in the 1750s, is called The Castle of Otranto. It's by Horace Walpole. If you read it today, it kind of seems almost like a joke, but it's got everything. It's got giant castles with huge statues in it. And the opening scene, Manfred, who's sort of the hero villain, is bringing in a beautiful young woman from one of the neighboring or his brother aristocrats to marry his son. But in the first couple of pages, the son is walking across the courtyard and the gigantic helmet falls off the gigantic statue and squashes the son, so that when the young woman intended for the son gets to the estate, They don't quite know what to do with her, but then Manfred decides that he's going to marry her. But she doesn't want that, and Manfred's daughter wants to help the girl, and from there on there's chases through dungeons and subterranean tunnels and bleeding, I mean, you name it. It's Gothic, but a little bit almost of a parody, though Horace Walpole doesn't think of it in that way. The two names I want you to know that influenced Jane Austen with regard to what she does in Northanger Abbey, which some people think of as a parody of a Gothic novel, though I think it's a lot more than that, are Anne Radcliffe, who is mentioned in the novel many times. In fact, Catherine and Isabella are reading The Mysteries of Udolpho, which is probably Anne Radcliffe's most famous novel, and she is a very successful Gothic novelist. And the other book that's mentioned, besides some ones that are never read, that, as you will see, Isabella gives Catherine a list of these. They are real novels, but nobody reads them. But the big-time novels that are mentioned, the other one in the Gothic genre is The Monk by a guy whose real name is Matthew Gregory Lewis, but this becomes so famous that people start to call him Monk Lewis. I'm sorry this is flipped, but I'm doing selfie videos here, so that's the way it goes. And on the cover you can see Gothic architecture. See? The thing that distinguishes the Gothic architecture and that you can immediately use to label something Gothic is the broken arch. It's not a round arch like a Roman arch or a Romanesque arch. It's broken. Get it? Okay, so there it is. In any case, Jane Austen loved Gothics, and she also liked to make fun of Gothics, the same kind of thing that she does in Love and Friendship with Sensibility and so forth. And so when she begins to write Northanger Abbey, she's intensely, I would say she's almost obsessed with the conventions of the forms, the conventions of the literary forms that she is going to play off of or critique in some way. And I think there are really two of them here. One is clearly Gothic, and we will talk about that a lot. And the other is, I think, romance or sensibility, the kind of thing that you saw in Love and Friendship. And so, again, you for next time, are going to have a really, really long swath of reading over the weekend. I think something like 120 pages. And so you're going to have to write a very condensed summary on Monday. I mean, really condensed. So what I want to do now is go through some of the details that you're obviously not going to be able to touch on in your very general summary, so you will know what to look for and ways of thinking about what Jane Austen is doing in Northanger Abbey. So right out of the gate, I want you to think about this. This novel begins with Jane Austen comparing her heroine to a romance heroine or a sensibility heroine. And the whole premise is that how can Catherine, or the question is, how can Catherine be a heroine when she has none of the conventional characteristics of a heroine? Again, this is going to be flipped because of my unfortunate camera situation, but you could almost do a grid like this and put on the one side, I've got reality, but let's just say everyday life. That is to say Catherine, and on the other side, conventions of a romance heroine. And you could list them and effectively come up with a profile of a conventional romance heroine by adding up all the things that Catherine isn't. So I'm not going to go too in detail. You'll figure this out right out of the gate. But Jane Austen here is clearly saying to her audience, see, I really know a lot about Gothics, and I know how romance novels work, and look at me, I'm an author. She really is kind of self-conscious, though it is pretty funny. In any case, In the first chapter, then you find all the things that Catherine should have read and all of the things she should be doing as opposed to the things that she is doing. She turns out to be kind of a cool tomboy. At one point, it even says she likes to play baseball. Wow. Who knew that baseball was being played in Jane Austen's time? Well, long story, but yeah, something called baseball actually was being played in her time in England. And she likes to roll down hills and do stuff that young kids normally like to do rather than the kinds of things she should be doing as a romance heroine. In any case, so that's the first kind of contrast between convention on one side and everyday life, I suppose you would say, on the other side, that you're going to see throughout this novel. We also find out that there aren't any mysterious, beautiful young men in the neighborhood to show up at her door. We find out there's no baronets even closer by who might have wonderful sons that she could become enamored with. I mean, she just hasn't got any of the kinds of surroundings or individuals that's necessary for her to be a heroine. She's a clergyman's daughter. She lives in a small village. But luckily for her, she gets invited by the Allens, who are a fairly well-to-do family that live nearby, probably the most well-to-do in the neighborhood, to go to Bath. All right, Bath. I will talk to you a lot more about Bath in writing later, but Bath is a spa. It's a tourist trap. It's a highly popular place for people to meet. It's a real hub of the marriage market because of the assemblies, the upper rooms and the lower rooms where large balls are given, and there's even a master of ceremonies whose job is to introduce appropriate young people to each other. And it is also a spa for health reasons, and so older people or people who are sick will go there to effectively, what I call it, simmer themselves in the hot sulfuric baths that had been used since Roman times and that smell like rotten eggs. Fun. They would even drink this water, but we'll talk more about Bath later. In any case, with regard to this trip then, Jane Austen plays the same kinds of convention and reality tricks, or convention and everyday life tricks, that she has in the first chapter. On page 42, for example, Mrs. Morland, Catherine's plain old normal mother, should be cautioning her against the violence of such noblemen and baronets as must delight in forcing young ladies away to some remote farmhouse. But what does she actually counsel her about? Well, probably what your mother would counsel you about, which is keep yourself warm, put a wrapper on your throat, don't catch cold or COVID or whatever's out there, and don't spend too much money. Bye. All right? Again, this is the game Jane Austen is playing. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. All right, moving on. I'm going to skip over a whole lot of things. I'm going to skip over the first ball at the upper rooms, and again, I will be sending you a map of Bath, and you will know intimately where all these places are, which is kind of boring because they don't know anybody, but then at the end, some guys say something nice about Catherine, so that makes her feel good. And move to page 48, where Jane Austen really, she's doing the same thing, but it gets to be a lot more complex and a lot more interesting than the earlier comparisons. Because the Master of Ceremonies introduces Catherine to a young man named Henry Tilney, who is a clergyman, but he certainly doesn't talk like your average clergyman, and you will learn more about him later. He's a very witty guy, and as they start to talk, he's just being very natural, very winning. Catherine can talk to him fairly easily. He's just being a normal human being, not affected, not nervous, just the kind of guy you want to meet, actually, talking to Catherine Morland. And then, suddenly, at the bottom of 48, he shifts. Boom. Listen to this. After chatting some time on such matters as naturally arose from from the objects around them, he suddenly addressed her with, "I have hitherto been very remiss, madam, in the proper attentions of a partner here. I have not yet asked you how long you've been in Bath, whether you were ever here before, whether you have been in the upper rooms, the theater, and the concert, how you like the place altogether. I have been very negligent. But are you now at leisure to satisfy me in these particulars? If you are, I will begin directly." Catherine's can't figure out what he's doing. She can't figure out he's being ironic. She's pretty naive. So she goes, "You need not give yourself that trouble, sir." "No trouble, I assure you, madam." And then, forming his features into a set smile and effectively softening his voice, he added with a simpering air, "Have you been long in Bath, madam?" And now Catherine's sort of starting to get it. "About a week, sir," replied Catherine, trying not to laugh. And then Henry just goes off, asking what are pickup lines, standard conventional pickup lines. Instead of talking like a normal person, he tries to do, or he parodies and satirizes himself as an actor, the usual pickup lines for the upper rooms in Bath. Okay, who is Henry Tilney like?